Actually, one thing that about this real name protest that I think is pretty interesting that you mentioned, it's kind of like there should be an official channel for people to do this, which is the petitioning system. But then it doesn't actually work. So people got frustrated and they started to do this real name protest online instead. Is this something that causes a lot of protests in China? The fact that people feel like they don't have another, they don't really have another way to get what they want. So the way to do it is through protesting?
I think it plays no small part in a lot of these cases, and it's not just petitioning. So there are many different official channels for technically for resolving a lot of these issues that we're observing in the China Dissent Monitor database. Whether for example, housing, a lot of the housing cases technically don't need to be resolved through petitioning. Petitioning is sort of the last measure that somebody would go to or a group would go to. But they'll go to, I had mentioned this before, they'll go to a regulatory body, and supposedly those regulatory bodies are supposed to play a role in regulating this industry, this sector. And when people perceive that it's really not working and they're not seeing any movement, or people are dragging their feet, the government is dragging their feet, or the company's continuing not to resolve the issue, they resort to these less institutional or these non-institutional means. They go out in public, they try to get attention in their case, to put pressure on the people in power in these cases. And I think that is the key dynamic in most of these protests. Why do people in a situation where there's so much risk associated with this action, why do they go to these? From their perspective, they might wish, the average person might wish to resolve it through a less risky means. So they would like to use an institutional channel. And in a lot of these cases, they've tried. They'll write letters as a group, individually. Sometimes they do resort to petitioning, as you had mentioned. I mean, there's millions of petitions every year. And when it doesn't work, and people know that it seems like they're not going to get any response from the official channels, they resort to these more non-institutional means to put pressure on the powerful actors to do something.
And in 5 to 10% of cases, it works.
That's a big gamble.
And it's probably more than that, but we can only record direct evidence in 5 to 10% of cases.
Well, nonetheless, it's a much smaller percent than the 25% where you've measured direct repression, and probably more than that where there is repression. So if you have a 5 to 10% chance of getting any concessions, but at least a 25% chance of being repressed, like those are bad odds. Like don't go to Vegas with those odds.
Yeah.
Don't go to China with those odds. I guess one last question I have is what kind of impact do you hope the China Dissent Monitor will have? I mean, you mentioned sort of clarifying some misconceptions about Chinese people, but is there anything else you have in mind?
I mean, it goes back to the information gap. That was really the driving issue. The information gap underlies a lot of other problems. So not only misconceptions, whether you think protest is not frequent, or misconceptions about Chinese people or Chinese citizens, but also the ability of people outside and inside of China to have an understanding about what's going on in the country or in their own communities. If you don't have access to this information, however you want to use it, it's limiting your understanding of the social and sort of political reality around you. If we talk about people outside of China believing that protest is not very frequent, well, there probably is a lot of people inside of China that believe that collective action and protest is also not very frequent, because that information is kept from them too, even more so. So getting this information out there is really potentially has a lot of knock-on effects to how people understand their own communities in China, but again, also outside of China, how they understand what's going on in the country. And just one sort of clear example of that would be this idea that particularly as Chinese nationalism grows and the Communist Party relies on images of nationalism and it promotes it externally. It also wants to give this perception in a lot of cases that Chinese people are all nationalists and that they're all towing the line and all towing the one party, the line, they all support the one party regime and sort of believe in its nationalist goals. And, while there is a lot of nationalism in China, and this might be true for some people, the story is much more diverse and complex than that. And there are a lot of people that aren't necessarily concerned with the nationalist machinations of the Communist Party and their foreign goals and adventurism. They're much more concerned with stuff that happened in their life and injustices in their communities, and trying to get food on the table or trying to make sure that they have a house that they paid for, and or that they're able to go to work because of COVID lockdowns. And I think being able to hear the voices of Chinese people directly through what they're actually concerned about and what they're saying and what they're willing to take risks to protest for, that's really the objective of China Dissent Monitor, is to elevate and amplify those voices.
Well, I know we definitely appreciate having some good data on this. It is, as you say, an information gap. So, yes, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll put a link to this in the description below for people to check out. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest in this.
Well, I think that the database is going to be really useful, especially as we move on and people have to become more and more creative about dissent in China. Like we mentioned the case of that guy who hung those banners. Mm-hmm. And Kevin mentioned that like hanging banners is a pretty common way of protesting in China, actually. But what I found interesting and didn't expect is that after he got taken away by police, then people started replicating his message in, remember, public mm-hmm. bathrooms, mm-hmm. right? Like places where they knew that, because they knew that there was a risk of being caught by all of the surveillance cameras, but there's no surveillance cameras in the restroom.
You would hope.
Well, the problem is that if the party feels like it needs to start putting cameras in bathrooms, it will.
Oh, you got to feel bad about
safety.
The person who has to monitor those.
They'll find somebody who likes it.
Oh, no.
I was not expecting you to go there. But I guess what I was going for was the idea that people can get creative with the forms of dissent.
Yeah. And that really is, like, you see that with all, like, protest movements under authoritarian regimes, just the amount of creativity that comes out, because you have to.
I mean, but sometimes in authoritarian regimes, you don't have to do much to protest. Like in Iran, all you have to do is take off your headscarf if you're a woman. Like that's such a big protest that the symbolism of that is well understood. It's widely seen as dissent, and it's a very simple act that anyone can do. So,
except for all the men.
It's a relatively simple act that a lot of people can do. Yes.
Or things like, oh, that person hanging up those banners would not have made a splash in any other country where protest is legal, right?
Right.
But because it was China, like right ahead of the party Congress, it was like 24/7 like coverage from Western media from all over the world.
Yeah. He probably had no idea what kind of impact he was going to make.
Yeah. And that one in particular was very interesting to see how like there would be like, Chinese Instagram channels that like document the people recreating that protest message all throughout the world. And that really had the effect of a lot of, Chinese dissidents understanding that they aren't alone, actually, that there are lots of people who are not happy with the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I actually listened into some Twitter Spaces calls that happened after that among Chinese dissidents, and there was a real sense that like, oh, well, like they were like, we need to capitalize on this, where like people, people are doing things. Yeah.
And that's why this China Dissent Monitor is so important, because it provides that information that yes, things are happening, and that's good, not just for people outside of China, but for people inside of China to know that, hey, we aren't alone. So I highly encourage you to check it out. We'll have a link below. And thank you for watching this episode of China Unscripted.